It's always the same feeling, I guess, when I'm taking a photo. It's those elements are all coming together in my mind that makes me go, oh, I better get out the camera. This feels like I want to take a photo of this.
Hey everyone, I'm Ian Plant, and today I have a very special guest. I'm talking with famous landscape photographer Sean Bagshaw, who is not only an incredibly talented photographer, but is also one of the nicest and coolest people I've ever met in the industry. Sean, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Ian. It's great to be here. Yeah, that was a pretty glowing intro. I hope I can live up.
Well, I hope so as well. I'm putting a lot of pressure on you, so don't choke.
We'll see.
I'd like to learn a little bit more about your background before you started in photography. Every superhero has an origin story. What's your origin story?
Well, my previous career was as a middle school science and math teacher, and I did that for about 10 or 12 years up until about, I think 16 years ago was when I stopped being a middle school teacher. And also when I was in college and in my younger days, I did a lot of climbing and mountaineering and expeditioning and that kind of stuff, just recreationally, just for my own enjoyment, stuff I like to do. But that's where my photography started. Is I started taking photographs with film, just very rudimentary documentary photographs, just to try to record some of the adventures I was going on and to have some images that I could put into slideshows and capture my friends and relatives in dark rooms and make them watch my climbing slides.
Your climbing background shows up in your photography a lot. I'm thinking of one particular photo that you sent to me for this program, and it's this mountain scene. The mountain looks very wicked and jagged and remote. Can you tell me a little bit more about that photo?
Sure, that's in the Italian Dolomites, and actually I didn't have to climb to get there. I was shooting with a 400 millimeter lens from the valley below there. Actually, I was up a little bit, but we didn't climb much to get into that particular spot. But it's that kind of imagery and scenes like that and views like that that I experienced when I was doing my mountaineering and my climbing back in my younger days. That it was scenes like that were so captivating to me that they really moved me and motivated me to want to record them, to photograph them, and then share those kind of scenes with other people. Because not everyone has the opportunity or the interest to be in environments like that.
Okay, well, I have to confess, I'm a little disappointed by that answer. When I first looked at that photo, I thought to myself, oh man, he must have done this like really gnarly ice climbing to get up to this spot. And he was on this cold summit in the wind. And it turns out that none of that really happened.
None of that happened for that photo. Yeah. A little disappointing. Unfortunately, I know that, back in the days when I could pull off climbing moves like that, I wasn't a very good photographer. And now that I can do the photography better, my climbing abilities have somewhat abandoned me. So I don't know if we'll ever see a full crossover of the two skill sets.
Well, nonetheless, even if the photo isn't quite living up to expectations, it's still wonderfully beautiful, and I absolutely love it. And it seems to me that there is a real passion there that's evident. Your passion for the landscape and for capturing the magic of the moment. So tell me more about what inspires you, what drives you to make photographs, and maybe just give us a little bit of a summary about what it is that you're looking to capture when you're out there making pictures.
Sure. I think we're probably fairly similar in this, is that my photography is almost completely experience driven. And it's about being in the places, like you said, kind of in these moments of time where light or position or atmosphere and weather and and a lot of those elements, a lot of times coming together simultaneously. It's being there and having that experience that motivates the photography. And the reality is I would be out there doing that kind of stuff regardless of taking photos. And a lot of times I'm out without a camera. So the experience comes first. I want to go have the experience. If I have a camera with me and I'm able to record it, in a way that I can then communicate that to someone else through the images, then that's a bonus for me. But first and foremost comes having the experience.
Now, in my experience, there are, generally speaking, two types of photographers. There are photographers who are very meticulous in their planning, and they plan out every single detail. And once they figure out what they want to do, they just go to the same location over and over again until they get the shot. And then there's other photographers who aren't really into the planning, who just immerse themselves in the landscape and react to what the landscape offers to them. And I definitely fall into that second category. I'm not really a big fan of meticulous planning. What kind of photographer are you? Which side of the divide do you fall on? Are you a planner, or do you more react to what the landscape offers you?
I'm going to say I'm definitely more of a reactor, I think. I'm like you. I definitely do some planning, and I think that, good luck, as they say, comes down to how much planning and work you put in, and you make your own luck. Before I go to a place, I'll certainly research. I'll have some ideas about maybe some initial objectives, and I'll see what kind of other photographs have been taken in the area, and just have a sense of why I'm going there or what I'm going to see when I get there. But most of the time when I'm in the space, it's really reacting to what's going on. It's just being out there, spending lots of time and following the light, following what's intriguing me about the landscape, what is inspiring me in that particular experience at that moment, and then figuring out from there, what's the photograph I want to make. And a lot of times I end up taking photographs that are completely unexpected. Some of my favorite photographs are ones that I had no idea existed or that I was going to see or experience. And yeah, a lot of times people that I work with doing photo education, they'll ask me, why did you take that photo? And I said, well, let's say it's a tree. It wasn't because it's a tree that I took the photo. There was something about it, it was the way the tree was moving or the way the light was interacting with the tree in that moment that made me photograph that. And the interesting thing is, when I photographed that tree, I was standing, on the rim of the Grand Canyon, and chose to photograph the tree instead of the Grand Canyon because that's what was interesting me in that moment.
So what is it exactly that's catching your interest? To reframe the question, there's a lot of, I know it when I see it in this business. And it's always a struggle, I know for me, when I'm trying to teach other people about photography, to explain things in more objective terms, to turn that I know it when I see it into something forward-thinking, tools that the photographer can apply so that they can find it for themselves. So what is it exactly that you are looking for in objective terms when you're trying to make a successful photograph?
Yeah, I agree with you, Ian. That's for me, the trick is to figure out what is it, because it does come down to a lot of, it when you see it, but not everyone knows it when they see it. And that's something that you build up over time, I think, is that sensibility of knowing it when you see it. So a lot of times it's a combination of things, and it could be any combination of these things, but composition, something that's really compelling me about the relationships in the forms in the landscape in front of me and how they line up with each other or point towards each other or separate different objects within the scene. So composition is definitely a big one, but light for me is probably the main one. So where is the light? What's the quality of light? How's the light interacting? And not just light only, but light and shadow and areas of light and shadow, because, when things are bright, they really are what stand out in the photograph. So if there's a subject, something in that scene that's being lit and areas around it aren't being lit, then that particular subject's really going to come out of that photograph. So I'm really watching for things like spotlighting, or with mountains. We're talking about mountain photography. I think mountains are amazing kind of beacons of light, because when they're really high, they reach up into layers of the atmosphere or elevations where things like twilight or early light or late light are reaching them, but not the rest of the lower landscape around them. So, you can almost be guaranteed at some point in the day that high mountains are going to have that sort of light. Also, obviously dramatic weather, dark clouds, and then anything with motion. I think, landscape photography can be fairly static. So if I see some interesting motion, whether it's water or clouds, clouds or even just wind blowing, tree branches or things like that, figuring out how I can incorporate some sort of element of dynamic motion into the photos as well.
Let's talk about motion for a moment. In the photos that you sent me, there's this one that shows a stream with a small waterfall in the background, and there is some fall foliage in the foreground. And when I look at this photo, it gives me this sense of energy, of motion. How do you go about creating visual energy in your photographs? What is it that you do to capture that sense of vitality, of life, of movement in a static photograph?
Well, I think obviously using shutter speeds with moving objects and getting things to move through the scene. In that case, like the water that's kind of streaming through the scene gives some sense of that. But I think you can apply, even if it's not an actual sense of motion or actual motion, it's kind of a sense of motion of the viewer moving through the scene or the scene being somewhat dynamic. And in situations like that particular composition, working with real wide angle lenses and kind of extreme foreground to, kind of more distant subject matter in the scene can really give a sense of motion, can create a feeling of depth and distance. It also really creates a lot of converging lines, and that tends to make you feel like you're being kind of pulled into the scene or that you could walk through the landscape. So things like that. And anytime if there's weather that's happening that you can use a longer shutter speed on, like water, I think people have seen enough kind of blurred motion water that we get that. But to actually see the weather being, not frozen in time really gives a sense of time, that this cloud was passing by or that some sort of weather event was happening during the taking of the photo.
So it sounds to me that what you're saying is that it's the shapes that you include in your composition that get the viewer's eye moving, and that the juxtaposition of near elements versus far elements get the viewer moving back and forth within the composition. And this is what's creating the visual energy. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. I guess, I'd never thought about it in those clear terms, but I would say exactly that's what's going on with, even when you don't have anything that's actually moving in the scene, but getting the viewer to explore around the image and kind of move into the image visually or move from object to object within the image visually, can create that kind of dynamic experience for the viewer.
I wanted to go back earlier to something you said about the juxtaposition of shadow and light. And one of the photos that you sent me that I think really illustrates this concept is a shot that is of Moai on Easter Island. Can you tell us a little bit more about that image? It looks like it was a nighttime photo. Is that correct?
Yeah, so that's, probably the most famous, well-known grouping of the Moai statues on Easter Island there. They're very photogenic. And I was there a couple of times during our trip during the daytime, and we had some great light and whatnot. But we went back at night, and the moon, it was a full moon that night. It just happened to be, and it was rising kind of right behind the group of statues. And it was so bright that it was casting these great shadows that were, coming off the Moai directly towards me. And so, that was, when I saw that I knew kind of the lighting that I'd been waiting for in that situation, because I had the opportunity to create this really kind of deep, dynamic composition with the shadows in the foreground kind of leading right into the statues and kind of almost mirroring, those angles. And then having them be backlit, and then kind of the final element that really worked with that is because it was nighttime and because I was able to take a 7-minute exposure. I think it was 7 or 8 minute long exposure. The clouds were streaming off of the ocean right behind the statues. So during that exposure time, they're streaming over the top, kind of also mirroring that same kind of vanishing point of all these lines of shadows, statues, and clouds. And then during the exposure, and I planned it, I set my camera right on the edge of a shadow of one of the statues, knowing that over the 7-minute exposure that the moon would appear from behind the statue and that would create a little moon star. but that the moon wouldn't be in the exposure long enough or large enough to really kind of overexpose that area of the image. So I think all of those kind of elements together really brought all of that, that feeling of depth and motion and dynamicism to that scene.
Yeah, I love how you've got the bright cloud and the moonburst effect behind one particular moai. All the moai in this photo are basically the same, but what makes that one moai the focal point of the composition is the fact that you've got that brightness behind it. So I really like how you use that moonburst effect to draw the viewer's eye to what is most important in the composition.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. And your original question was about using light and shadow together. So that whole combination of kind of the light and shadow, kind of the stripes of light and shadow in the foreground, the stripes of light and shadow in the sky. You've got the dark moai with the light clouds behind them, so they're set out against that. And then that kind of ultimate burst of light where the moon's coming out, that kind of everything goes to that as the focal point.
So let's talk about the digital darkroom for a moment. And one question I like to ask people is, on a scale of 1 to 10, with 1 being a complete photo purist and 10 being like a full-on Photoshop manipulator, where do you fall on the scale? And how might your approach have changed over time? And why do you make the choices that you have?
I'm gonna put myself somewhere in the middle, maybe like a 5 or a 6 or a 7. But that's assuming that the far end of the scale is, kind of photo illustration or full composite type photo art. If that was a 10, yeah, I'm probably maybe a 5 or a 6. So I do quite a bit of work in Photoshop, but I don't do a lot of. I sometimes wish I was, because I have a lot of admiration for people who do really amazing kind of composition art or photo illustration, where they take elements from a lot of different photographs that weren't originally related and are able to combine those all together seamlessly. I don't have that kind of skill in Photoshop, first of all, number one. And number two, I'm not really a conceptual thinker, so I don't come up with ideas. Like I said, all my photographs are very experience-based. They're all based around something that literally happened to me as I was standing there, or just being out in the environment. So to come up with an idea and then execute on it like that and create this thing that didn't actually exist, that's not my skill set. But I think it's amazing. So in terms of the choices and coming to where I've come to in the kind of work I do, which is very Photoshop heavy or very, image editing heavy, comes from my frustrations with back when I was a film photographer. I was a horrible film photographer. And a lot of that was I didn't like the limitations that film put on me. That kind of once I clicked the shutter, that I was done with the process, with the creative process. I couldn't continue on. I wasn't working, with the kind of film that I could develop in a dark room. So I'd just wait to see when my slides came back, and they never quite lived up to the scene as I experienced it, as I imagined it in my mind. So when Photoshop and digital cameras became available to me, immediately I saw the potential to develop my images the way I always had wanted to. And I quickly embraced all kinds of things that weren't really available to slide film photography, but I wished had been. And I think, so as soon as I could, blend exposures or focus stack or really do some creative dodging and burning and sculpting of light in photos, and also really working with color palette and that kind of stuff, immediately I was just relieved actually to have that kind of control.
It's interesting because I've been looking at your work for a long time, and if someone had asked me the question 5 or 6 years ago, I would have said that I thought you were doing a fair amount of digital darkroom manipulation. But with your more recent work, I think there's very little. It looks like your more recent photos are much more naturally processed. Am I correct in this assumption? Has there been a change over time, and why?
There probably has been a change over time. That's interesting. I'm assuming, just because as we progress and as we get better at things early on, you make certain editing choices that you just really don't have the experience or knowledge, or don't have a distinct vision of where you're trying to take it. And I think all that all of those things evolve and grow and improve with time. So I would say I'm sure that my work, I think, it's easy to make things really saturated or really, outlandish early on as a way to, as a crutch, maybe for other more nuanced parts of your photography and your editing that you haven't developed yet. And then as you develop those more nuanced sensibilities, then you start backing off some of those other things like lots of oversaturated color, or, all the kinds of things that we see in a lot of photography. But I'd also like to think that part of that maybe is kind of how photography has evolved, because I think some of the things that I was doing early on in image editing and Photoshop really stood out maybe 10 or 15 years ago because they were new. And now I think some of that stuff, I think other people, I'm still maybe doing it fairly similarly in some ways, and so many other people have taken it up to where I was and then beyond that now I think some of my work, just by comparison, doesn't look maybe quite so worked over.
Well, there's so many photographers out there these days, so I'm curious, what is it that you do to stand out? What is it that you try to inject into your photos that just screams Sean Bagshaw?
Well, I think for me, it all comes back to what I already said about the experience, is that if there's any, and I don't know if this comes through to anybody else, but what I see in my photographs that I think screams Sean Bagshaw is that all of the images that I end up putting out there that speak to me in some sort of way, I chose, or I've decided to make those the ones that I worked on and put out there because they speak to me and the experience that I had. And I feel like, I guess, they're the ones that share those experiences the best with people who weren't there, through this kind of two-dimensional medium. So every image, I guess it goes back to, again, some of that, what we were talking about how planned out they are. Most of those images aren't hopefully images that you've seen 100 times before, because I didn't try to just go take a photograph that someone else has taken. And even if I was trying to do that, which I do, I'll go to a place and try to take a photo of I've seen before. But those aren't the ones that end up in my portfolio, because it's the more personal ones, the ones that when I see the image invokes kind of the story of the time and the place and how I got there and what I went through to get the photo. So I hopefully, if anything more than anything else, that's what screams Sean Bagshaw. And that's both in the way that the images were captured and which images were captured, and in how I've developed or processed those images to try to communicate that to the viewer.
So are you consciously trying to do something different with your photography? Are you trying to develop your own personal style? Or do you just go out there and react to what the landscape offers? And if it's something different, that's great. If it looks like the work that other people are producing, so be it. What are your thoughts on this?
I think for me, and the kind of the way my brain works, it's again, because I'm not very conceptual and I'm not very deliberate, that I'm mostly working off of by feel a lot of it. I think, I think that's probably true. Is I'm not really trying to create any particular sort of look. It's more about, what appeals to me and what excites me. And I think through that, and because those kinds of things are fairly consistent for me over time, that there does end up being a body of work that has some consistency to it. And so it's things like color, it's quality of light, it's hopefully, kind of a sense of drama. And we were talking a little bit earlier about some dynamic feel and some motion, some visual kind of interest of motion in the image. So all of those things combined with kind of this sense of adventure and exploration of, going out in places and just being really excited about what I'm seeing out there. I think all of those elements come together into some sort of consistency, because it's always the same feeling, I guess, when I'm taking a photo. It's those elements are all coming together in my mind that makes me go, oh, I better get out the camera. This feels like I want to take a photo of this. But yeah, in terms of, oh, I'm going to be the guy known for this particular type of processing, or this particular subject matter, or this particular, like all of my images follow this similar compositional rules or things like that. No, I don't think too much about that.
Whenever I do these interviews, I always ask the photographer I'm talking with to send me 10 to 15 of their personal favorite photos, the ones that are the most meaningful to them and that they feel best represent their work. And I'm always a little bit surprised at the photos that they send because they don't necessarily strike me as being the ones that would be their most popular photos. And I think this, of course, makes sense because I think that every artist probably has their own personal favorites that are very different from their most popular work. And one of the photos that you sent me in particular, I think really illustrates what I'm talking about here. It's this really low-key, subtle image of a field of flowers with some weather in the background. I look at this photo and I think it is beautiful and I love its subtlety, but it's not likely the kind of photo that will attract a lot of attention when posted on the internet. But I think it is much more representative of your skills as an artist than some of your bolder, more colorful photos. So please tell us more about this photo and why it speaks to you.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad that comes through in that image. Because I feel the same way about it. Yeah, I think you're right. It's a photo that's special to me. It speaks to me. I really enjoy it. But yeah, it's not a blazing red sunset. It's not lightning. It's not a tornado. It's not sensationalistic like that. Which in that, a lot of that times, that's the kind of stuff that plays well on the internet, for better or for worse. But yeah, no, that's in the Coast Range of Northern California, and that's an area that I've known about for years. I've been there a few times, and the lupin bloom that happens there in the spring can really vary from year to year. And so that particular year we went there couple years ago, it was one of the best blooms I'd ever seen, and that was combined with this. We were in the morning that morning, we were right on the edge of this really thick fog. So the light that was coming through the fog was magical. I mean, again, coming back to the experience I had, I love that photo. I still don't feel like I've fully captured the quality of lighting that was happening there, that we were experiencing, in the photo, the way it really was. But I feel like at least of all the photos I took that morning, it comes the closest to that. But yeah, it was just that kind of being on the edge of the fog. So the light coming through just so soft and filtered. And it was also variable because the fog was variable. So there were areas that were lighter and areas that were darker, even though it's a very subtle difference, very glowing. And the color, those kind of blues and purples that are in the lupin were just spectacular. And then that fog bow, yeah, that's coming down. It is the end of a fog bow that's coming down in the center of the photo. I tried a lot of different compositions with wider angle and different framings to try to get the whole fog bow in. And I have some shots of that I like, but it de-emphasized the flowers and the light on the flowers. And so of all the images, I don't know if it works. I think if the whole fog bow was in there, that might play better on the internet because it'd be more recognizable. But for me, I just love that composition of the flowers in the foreground, the light that was on them, and then kind of this almost, end of the fog bow was this kind of like this weird shaft of odd light just coming down into the center of the frame. Yeah, I don't know, just it's different. It was a great experience, and I feel like that for me best represents the being there and experiencing it.
Well, this photo really inspires and amazes me, so hats off to you, sir, and you've got an incredible body of work, and it's been really great having you on the program, so I want to thank you for coming on and for sharing your insights about the art of photography. It's been wonderful. Thanks.
Thanks, Ian. It's been great talking to you also. Always great to talk to you, and as you know, we've both been doing this a long time. I've admired your work. In fact, you were some of my early inspiration, I know, going way back into the early 2000s.
Well, the inspiration has been mutual. You know, you and I have been coming up in this business around the same time, so I've always admired your work. And it was a real privilege to finally meet you in person, and I'm so glad you were able to join us today. You're a super insightful guy, and I really appreciate you coming on the program today.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
And I want to thank you, the viewer, for joining us today for this amazing conversation. And please stay tuned for the next incredible photo adventure. And if you've liked what you've seen here today, then please subscribe to Shutter Monkeys TV on YouTube. Thanks.